A grim Afghan anniversary. It's a year since devastating U.S. airstrikes hit a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, killing 42 people. Although the charity group considers the event a war crime, the Pentagon claims it was just a tragic mistake. Western sanctions on Syria are causing enormous suffering among the population and making aid work almost impossible, according to a leaked UN report. Also, Hungary rejects the EU's migrant quota plan in a referendum labelled a watershed for Europe. The turnout was too low to be valid, but the Prime Minister says Parliament will still act on the result. Just a little after midday this Monday here in Moscow. You're tuned into RT International. I'm Ewan O'Neill. Welcome. 1 year ago today, a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz in Afghanistan was hit by over 200 shells during a now infamous U.S. airstrike. 42 people, including 3 children, died during the bombardment and 37 were injured.
Light went off. He said here. In the meantime, this place was hit, and that caused Dr. arm was amputated. And he kept sitting and bombed everywhere was bombing. Finally, when he died, I left him in this area. I tried a lot to take his dead body out of the site to prevent him from burning, but he burned, and everybody burned.
Minutes into the air assault, Doctors Without Borders informed U.S. officials of what was happening. However, it's claimed the attack continued for over half an hour after that. The hospital is still not able to reopen, depriving the area of a crucial medical facility. A U.S. military investigation found that 16 service members failed to comply with the rules of engagement, but Washington denies the sustained bombing was a war crime.
This was unintentional, an unintentional action. That is the principal reason why we do not consider this to be a war crime.
Well, several of those service members were suspended after the probe, but none faced charges because, as you just heard, the attack was deemed unintentional. Former CIA officer Jack Rice says it's civilians who suffer for U.S. foreign policy failures.
The Americans can't simply stomp around the world and believe that they can be held to a different standard because they're the United States. That's inappropriate, and it frankly encourages others to act accordingly. And that doesn't help anybody. Sadly, it's the civilians who will always end up paying the price, no matter where they are. Generally speaking, for them to be prosecuted, they would have had to prove that it was intentional or that it was gross negligence. That's generally what you would see in an international criminal court. But frankly, even if that could be established, it's unlikely that it will ever take place, because the reality is that when it comes to the United States, what the United States will do is fail to turn those people over to proper authorities for prosecution.
With more on what many see as America's double standards on airstrikes, here's ianya, sejak.
When Russia was accused of bombing civilian targets in Syria, Washington called it intentional and wanted Moscow to be held responsible.
I don't have the facts. No doubt in my mind that the Russians are responsible.
When the U.S. is reported to have hit civilians, the Pentagon launches a probe which can last for many months. Unlike with the bombing of the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, a Pentagon investigation usually comes to the conclusion that its bombing was unintentional and therefore not a crime. In those cases, as in others, Washington is slow to accept responsibility.
We will look at the reports to see if they're credible, and if they are credible, we'll investigate them.
What Assad and Russia are doing in Aleppo is soul-shattering. It's a gift to ISIL and Nusra Front.
In Russia's view, ISIL and al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, have persistently received gifts from the U.S. in the form of weapons which Washington sends to the rebels and which often end up in the hands of terrorists. When the September ceasefire in Syria fell apart, Washington cleared itself and the rebels that it backs of any responsibility.
It is really tragic that the agreement we worked so hard to achieve, that could have produced a way forward, has been fatally undermined by the actions of the regime and Russia.
In their verdict, U.S. officials admitted the fact that some of the leading rebel groups in Syria refused since the beginning to abide by the ceasefire and to separate themselves from al-Nusra. They also admitted the fact that on day 5 of the so-called ceasefire, the U.S. bombed the Syrian military, admittedly by mistake, which nearly allowed ISIL to take over the city of Deir ez-Zor in Syria. Another note on Washington's perception of its own actions. In the past, when the U.S. military had some tense encounters with ships or aircraft near the borders of other countries, like Iran and Russia, the U.S. invariably claimed it was the other countries that were being provocative, even though it was the U.S. that came to their border. The U.S. government hardly ever sees its own actions as being potentially provocative. In a certain sense, governments are like people. They try to shield themselves in every possible way, but they're quick to pass a verdict when it's about another government. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chakyan, RT.
Well, an internal UN report leaked to the online publication The Intercept has strongly criticized Western sanctions on Syria. It says they're punishing the country's population and hampering aid work. EU and US sanctions were most recently imposed on Syria back in 2011 in an attempt to force President Assad to step down. They include trade restrictions. Among them is a ban on exporting oil. That's hit Syria the hardest. Revenues from oil sales previously accounted for around 20% of Syrian GDP. European and American banks also froze Syrian government assets, as well as stopping all financial dealings right here at the bottom with Syrian state-owned banks. That part is important. According to the author, the sanctions are extremely harsh when it comes to the provision of humanitarian aid, and bureaucratic procedures discourage many organizations from working in Syria. Even the United Nations itself is prevented from delivering certain necessary medical supplies. The report also says that those restrictions on Syrian banks have led to the creation of an unofficial network of money exchange, often used by terrorists. Well, we spoke to Rania Khalek, to whom the report was leaked.
I asked the State Department how, their response to the fact that the UN is saying that these sanctions are the most extreme and far-reaching that have been imposed of any sanctions regime they could think of. And the response was that any humanitarian issues that have arisen in Syria are all to be blamed on the Syrian government. I don't even know if these sanctions benefit the U.S. because I don't think the U.S. knows what its end game is. These sanctions, if anything, are benefiting the regime in some ways because it's just making people more dependent on the government than they otherwise would be. But otherwise, I really can't see in the grand scheme of things who these sanctions benefit. They're hurting the Syrian economy. They're destroying the Syrian economy. People can't pay their aid workers and they end up having to shut down various programs or not deliver various items that are desperately needed. And in the case of groups like al-Nusra and ISIS, of course, it's easier for them or any other criminal really to be, messing with funds or even embezzling or, getting money to places that they shouldn't be going to, whether it's to terrorist groups or other criminal gangs.
The Syrian conflict is widely regarded as the greatest humanitarian emergency since World War II. It's created a huge number of refugees, and many now find themselves internally displaced. Children there are suffering hugely as well. Many don't even know what a normal life feels like. RT's Murat Gazdiev reports from the capital, Damascus.
Desperate times call for desperate measures, and for Syria, that time is now. Have you ever seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire? Well, these are the kids from that movie in real life. They're street children, orphans, beggars, and they're valuable. In one day, they bring in an average of $20. May not seem like much, but in Syria, that's a lot. Now imagine what happens when you have 5, 10, 20 of these kids working for you. Stealing, begging, fighting, that's their existence. The war has deprived them of a childhood.
For them, this is the life. They don't know that there is another life, human life. They live out of humanity, out of childhood. And they don't realize that they live this miserable life.
Almost all of these kids are internally displaced. Millions have fled to government-controlled territory, and not always together.
مثلا بسكوت أواعي بطاطا أكل مثلا بروح أبيع بسكوت مصاحف شو ما يطلع ببيع.
They accused, sexual accused, almost all of them. Yes. And they have very bad violence inside. Sometimes they cut themselves.
At such a young age?
Yes. Yeah. And some of have drug issues.
Already? 7, 8-year-olds then?
Yes. Yeah.
So where do you even begin? One of the teachers actually explained it to me. These children are like blank pieces of paper. They haven't learned anything, they don't know anything, they don't know there can be a better life. And the point of this school is to turn those pieces of paper into roses, to let these kids flower. Sayar, the group behind this, started a year ago, funding itself. They invited a few children once a week to learn the alphabet and to draw. The number has grown to 100. You start with the basics.
Before they stole, they lie, everything, but they don't know that it is bad to do those things.
Unfortunately, the children's employers don't always want them to know the difference. They stand to lose hundreds of dollars a day.
He told us, if you're not gonna stop, I'm gonna kill you.
The kids write, draw, sing, and play. They're taught how to be children. And the key to it all is trust.
This is the first time that they feel that somebody is caring about them and there is somebody who loves them.
The UN, the Red Cross are busy doing different things. Sayar is the only group helping the thousands of street children in Syria. The government does what it can, but if Europe is struggling to deal with a few million migrants, what hope does Syria have of providing for 5 times that?
Murat Gazdiev, RT from Damascus, Syria.